Hi, I'm Tom Zimmerman from the EMDR podcast. This episode is about really just some sensible modifications that we might make that's a little bit different than the general guidance and basic trainings to just let things go where they go. Letting things go where they go with clients with really complex trauma is a pretty bad idea in many cases. In foundational EMDR training, we instruct you to just let things go where they go. And for relatively healthy people, the people we initially train you to work with, this is the best and most effective way to work. In fact, a large part of what healing is for people with a fair amount of adaptive information is seeing the connection between the various types of wounding that they've encountered. Encouraging things to go where they may need to go can create the possibility of insight during healing for your healthier clients. And perhaps it can even promote broader generalization. The problems come when we leave the training and try to implement the let things go where they go guidance in clinical settings with clients with very little adaptive information and a very small window of tolerance. Things tend to go straight off a cliff. Then EMDR therapy all of a sudden doesn't seem like this magic wand that simply dissolves whatever memory we pointed at. It may seem like a match that sets the paper, sets the pile of paper on the desk on fire, then the curtains, then the room, then the house, then the neighborhood, then half of Chicago, like in the 1870s. And it's easy for you, the therapist, to trace the origin of this kind of burned out catastrophe back to the match that started in your own hand. So clients having re-traumatizing experiences inside EMDR therapy is one of the main reasons why therapists and clients disengage from it. So if EMDR therapy isn't a magic wand with clients with severe and complex trauma, what is it? Where's the magic? And to understand this, we really need to look at the AIP model. And at the core of the AIP model is the idea that we can connect old stuck information into right now existing adaptive information, assuming we have enough of it in the areas where it's needed. I use the boat and fish metaphor throughout almost everything I've done on the EMDR podcast to describe the memory content, how the memory content needs to connect to the existing adaptive information. Metaphorically, you cannot land a whale of a memory into adaptive information the size of a canoe. So if that's the magic in EMDR, connecting stuck information into existing positive information, that's also where its limit is found. If the pathway of healing in EMDR therapy is that the maladaptive stuff has to connect to the existing adaptive stuff, here's some questions I want you to ponder. When would your client with complex trauma have had the opportunity to develop this adaptive information? And I realize in phase one that we really are focused, perhaps overly focused, on assessing the client's wounding. But if what we're doing is connecting stuck stuff to adaptive stuff, can you see why attempting to assess the client's fund of adaptive information is also an essential phase one task? How can you know for sure how much adaptive information a client with complex trauma has? You can't. But what can you know in general about your most pervasively traumatized clients? People with complex trauma have been stuck in survival processes that may have kept them from developing much of the needed adaptive information. So we can know that their wounding is complex, typically spans many developmental eras, and contains many of the worst things that can happen to a human on this planet. So in short, assume a small boat when it's clear that their oceans are filled with monsters. There is typically an inverse relationship between the two. And I'm just going to suggest that you already knew this, even before your EMDR training. it's easy to misunderstand the magic that EMDR therapy is. The healthiest clients that we see were resourced well by life. Hundreds of thousands of positive experiences helped them develop much of the needed adaptive information to do EMDR therapy well. Being born to people who knew how to love right and consistently, and having the experiences over and over and over of nurture, agency, visibility, protection, importance, and guidance literally installs adaptive information into your human nervous system. It's easy to believe the lessons in the nostalgia of your earliest experience, and it's easy to believe the lies. For well-resourced clients, EMDR is like a magic wand. For everyone else, it's not. And the adaptive information processing model clearly explains why. So if we're in the position of having to connect large chunks of difficult information into small chunks of adaptive information, then we need to develop skills and strategies to do that more effectively. You make adjustments and accommodations already for your severely traumatized clients and what you already do with them. If there's hesitancy to make reasonable adjustments in EMDR therapy, then you may be operating from the assumption that EMDR therapy is a magic wand for all clients. Thus, you should be conducting exactly the same way for every client on your caseload, as though it's some type of spell or incantation. And we've already muddied those waters. You don't employ this level of rigidity in any other approach to therapy that you do. Why would you do this in this approach? Probably because that's how you were trained, or at least that's the impression that you got into your training. Rigid adherence to any protocol that is blind to the actual human nervous system in front of you isn't trauma-informed practice. It's trying to push your diversely shaped clients through some type of machine. As I've argued elsewhere, we need our interventions to match the shape of the client's nervous system. We need to make modifications based on sound clinical judgments, and this need is written into EMDRIA's definition of EMDR therapy. So remarkably little of what I'm saying here is actually controversial. So here are some places that I would suggest reasonable adjustments to standard protocol when working with clients with severely complex trauma. In each of these, I'm going to try to explain why Shapiro wanted us to do things in certain ways based on the AIP model, and why it makes clinical sense to at least consider making some adjustments based on the nervous system of the individual client you're working with. We need memory content to come, but we need it to come at a digestible rate and a tolerable rate. If it doesn't, the client may flood their basement, and we may spend the whole rest of the session dealing with the mess of that initial big wave of distress that may or may not include a shutdown response. The distress that comes and that we're encouraging the clients to notice needs to come inside their window of tolerance. All of the noticing that is productive in EMDR therapy happens in the present and happens within their window of tolerance. The ability to be and remain present requires a tolerable range of distress. So if the client spends the whole session re-experiencing the trauma as it happened, rather than its resonance in the present, that is typically a re-traumatizing and confirming experience. Healing happens when we have experiences that are different from the expectation in the bad memory, not when they're identical to them. Distress coming in small enough pieces that allows us to stay present with our current experience may be disconfirming enough for this memory reconsolidation work to occur. In short, clients have to experience the memory differently than the experience of a flashback. We need to help clients activate, but not overactivate. We need to also appreciate that complex trauma, when activated, doesn't want to come out in easily digestible pieces. We may need to help clients activate, but not overactivate. And here are just a few strategies to help clients do that. One of the most sensible ways to help clients manage distress, particularly in the first few targets we work on, is to start with smaller targets that do not connect to a lot of adjacent content. Dr. Shapiro is right in that if we start with Mount Everest, everything after that will feel like a small hill. However, my clients are not Olympians, and many of your clients are not Olympians. And from that AIP lens, you cannot connect Mount Everest to adaptive information the size of a walnut. And, jokingly, we need to appreciate that there are 200 dead bodies on Mount Everest right now. So if we need to tackle Mount Everest, and we eventually will need to, we better start with some small hills first. This guidance is not controversial when working with complex trauma. It's guidance that Dr. Shapiro makes half a dozen times in her core text when working with clients with complex trauma. Start with smaller stuff first. Working with memories that may be more recent, less connected to the whales of attachment wounding and other identity impacting themes is a great place to start. With really complex trauma, we may start with the person who pulled out in front of you in traffic 2 weeks ago, or an ex-partner a few partners ago, or a car accident in which no one was seriously hurt. This can allow the client to test the fishing gear, right? We spent all this time developing it. Let's test it with a relatively small fish. Helpful information about the client's nervous system, including clues about the client's ability to tolerate larger amounts of distress in future targets, are often revealed. Part of what's revealed is that the client have a boat. Does the client's boat float, right? Or are they just, clinging on to a little, leaky rubber ducky with their rod and reel in their hand? So if difficulties emerge, even with small targets, that's not failure. It's information. It's information about this client's nervous system, and that information is essential to the client's recovery. Now, even if we start with a smaller memory, is it possible that other memories may want to connect? Yes. And with a reasonably healthy person, we want to let them come and assume that there's a big enough window of tolerance. So just because memories want to come with a client with a really complex trauma, that doesn't mean that it's always a good idea to let them. Remember that many, many memories may be stored in individual memory networks of people with complex trauma. The body gets activated and lots of memories may want to come, almost like being drawn by the magnet of body activation. Some memories will want to come because they have the same body feel. Again, we need memory content to come in EMDR therapy, but we need it to come at a digestible rate. And if you're already hooked to a 700-pound tuna and you're in a 10-foot canoe, does it make sense then to hook on to 2 whales and 5 sharks? In the AIP lens, we can only land a fish that our boat can support. So helping clients decide what memories to let in is an important exercise in client agency. My metaphor for this is a barbecue grill in the backyard. The grill may spread smells all through the neighborhood, and lots of neighbors may smell it and want to come. But it's your house and your grill. They don't simply get to burst into your door, walk across your living room, open the sliding door to your yard, and open your grill and eat your food. It's your door. You get to decide who comes to this party. With clients with complex trauma, I'm helping them contain the memories that want to come, particularly when they're already struggling with the fish they're hooked onto. Again, we need distress and we need memory content to come, but it needs to come at a digestible rate and intensity. To complicate matters, transformational trauma therapies often work best when we're working with an individual representative memory. But clients with complex trauma, with these clients, there's a strong tendency to pivot from the individual memory to the theme. For instance, an individual memory that we're working on that involves cognitions about lovability can quickly pivot to the client trying to figure out if they're lovable. It's easy for clients to pivot from an individual memory to something that is existential. And if this doesn't make sense, I'd like to invite you to think about this example. Think about the last time you had heartache at the end of a relationship that may have ended in a way that you didn't anticipate or want. And at the real peak of that heartache, you were probably thinking of other instances of heartache. They may have come because they had the same body feel. So imagine how easy it is to pivot from an individual memory of heartache to the existential questions. Why does everyone I've ever loved hurt me? Am I ever going to find love? It's completely understandable that the nervous system would go there. But can you appreciate that EMDR therapy isn't a magic 8-ball, and it's not good at resolving most themes all in one chunk, and it rarely resolves existential questions. Focusing on an individual memory can bring healing, and healing can help the existential questions lose a lot of their urgency. But it's easy to start with an individual memory and wind up in a goose chase of trying to figure big things out. With clients with complex trauma, I often send them back to target when we bump against the broader theme or the existential edges of human experience. How your clients interact with the memory matters. And Shapiro wants basically to dump the whole memory into working memory all in one bite. However, that assumes you have a really big window of tolerance. Again, we need memory content to come, but we need it to come in digestible rates and digestible intensities that match the right now window of tolerance. So first, I don't want the client to be in the memory. I want the client to be in the present, glancing occasionally at the memory. And one of the most common forms of dissociation that I observe with my clients is that my clients are simply too into the memory and not present enough in this moment to notice deeply. The reason I want them present is that all of the noticing that's productive in EMDR therapy happens in the present, not in the memory. All healing happens in this present moment. And if the client is mostly processing and narrating on the memory channel with no attention to what they're noticing right here, right now, I want to direct them to the present. I want to ground them in the present. And if the client isn't having a different experience with the memory in EMDR therapy than what typically occurs in a flashback, I can almost guarantee you that their EMDR experience will be re-traumatizing. Relatedly, just like I don't want the client to be in the memory, I don't want the client to be present but focused constantly on the memory. Clients believe incorrectly that they have to constantly push into the distress of the memory. It's almost like they put on their football helmet and they're just, they're pushing constantly into the distress of the memory. This is a recipe for overactivation for many clients. Again, we want memory content to come, but it needs to come at a digestible rate and intensity. A better metaphor is to take a bite of the memory and notice that bite until it's digested. Then take the next bite, digest that bite, then take the next. And there's strategies for doing this well. These strategies can help promote the distress coming in ways that ripple inside their window of tolerance rather than saturate it and overtop it. So when clients struggle to take digestible bites of the memory, I may use a beanbag in session and invite them to toss it into the air. I ask the client to think about the memory only when the beanbag is in the air. Okay? This serves as a kind of timer to limit the amount of content and distress that comes into awareness all at once. And it may take multiple rounds of noticing with bilateral for that last bite of distress to start to dissipate before I encourage them to toss the beanbag again and get the next piece of the memory content to notice. Often clients, after 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 times of doing this, they can put the beanbag down once they no longer find distress when throwing the beanbag in the air. The most common way that I work with clients with complex trauma is using the videotape approach mentioned by Dr. Shapiro in her main text in the section on complex PTSD. The videotape approach is borrowed from Shapiro's recent event protocol, and it involves, at least the way I do it, it involves some modifications to standard protocol in phases 3 and 4. There are many ways to do it. I'm going to put the link to my script in the notes sections below this podcast. Essentially, what we're doing is we make the memory a piece of video, and we encourage the client to walk through each frame of the video chronologically, pausing and digesting each piece of distress with rounds of bilateral. And we're not allowing that video to play forward until the prior distress is largely metabolized. What that may look like is, what are you noticing? It's in my chest. It's really tight. Good. Notice that. What are you noticing? It's moving down. Notice that. What are you noticing? It's spreading out. It's getting lighter. Notice that. Good. Play the video forward. Let me know when you find the next piece of distress. Got it. Good. Notice that. See? So we do this in phase 4 until the client can play the memory and there's no distress in the video on any channel. Then we go to phase 5 and continue with standard protocol. It may seem that strategies to kind of microactivate the memory will take longer, and that's simply not true with clients with complex trauma. What dramatically slows reprocessing down is dealing with the overactivation and the problematic parts interactions that come in response to that. So parts that may have consented to do this work may not have anticipated this very distressing body feel and may have strong opinions about it. And then we may spend the whole rest of the session noticing the parts battle it out over how to deal with that initial big wave that bumped them out of the window of tolerance to begin with. Many clients with complex trauma will struggle reprocessing because of the volume, meaning memory, or the intensity of the memory content coming into working memory in very short periods of time. In review, these are some of the options I've covered when you notice clients struggle. Number 1, pick a memory that's more tolerable, especially when reprocessing, when clients are new to the reprocessing phases of EMDR therapy. Again, not controversial advice. Discourage other adjacent memories from coming, especially when the client is right now struggling to digest the distress they're currently noticing. Again, if you're already hooked to a fish that you're going to be lucky to land, don't hook on to 5 whales and 14 tuna. It's a terrible, terrible idea. Also, identifying quickly when the client has pivoted from an individual memory to a theme or to some type of existential rumination, and then quickly directing them back to the target is a really good strategy. Helping the client stay grounded in the present, not dissociated into the memory and not staring at the memory the whole time. Encourage the client to interact with the memory a little bit at a time. right? Little bite at a time, either by glancing at the memory, using a beanbag as a timer, or using the videotape approach described below. So when clients struggle working with memory content effectively, there are many, many strategies that can be helpful. When clients struggle, this is not failure. When clients encounter difficulty in any of the phases of EMDR therapy, it is not failure. It is information, and that information is coming as a gift. We want to use the information to help identify why they're struggling. And I want to encourage you to modify your interventions to match the information that you now have about your client's nervous system. Many EMDRIA consultants, many consultant and trainings can help you with this. Almost everything on the EMDR podcast is about this issue. So many newly trained therapists think that if they don't do EMDR therapy exactly as they're trained, client harm is likely to occur. We train you rigidly because we want you to understand what you're modifying from, so that you don't really quickly make your own Frankenstein therapy before you even understand what EMDR therapy is. Now that you understand, because we've trained you, how to work with a relatively healthy person, learn some sensible modifications so that your interventions can match the nervous system you're working with. Otherwise, you may be cramming your clients with severe trauma into a machine that poorly fits them. And that's not trauma-focused care. And EMDR therapy never was a machine. You can make sensible modifications and still be doing EMDR therapy. Often, that's what doing EMDR therapy well with clients with complex trauma is simply going to require of you. So, thank you.